The courtroom was silent. You could hear a pin drop. The judge, an old man with silver hair and sharp eyes, stared down at the defense attorney. Motion denied. His voice echoed through the room. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney, Mr. Clayton, stood frozen in place. His face turned pale as if all the blood had drained from it. He had fought hard to postpone the trial, begging for more time. He had presented a compelling argument, but the judge had just shattered his last hope. The defendant, a young man named Daniel Carter, slumped in his chair. His hands trembled. His mother let out a soft sob from the gallery, covering her mouth with a tissue. The prosecutor, Ms. Henderson, smirked slightly. She had been waiting for this moment. She was ready to strike, and now there was nothing in her way. But no one expected what happened next. Just as the judge's gavel struck the desk, a loud bang filled the room. A man in the back row shot to his feet, pointing something towards the front. People screamed. Some dove under the benches. Then, chaos erupted. 3 seconds. That's all it took for everything to turn upside down. Daniel's mother gasped. The judge's eyes widened. Mr. Clayton stepped back, raising his hands. And then, everything went black. 2 months earlier, Daniel Carter was just another 22-year-old, trying to make ends meet. He worked 2 jobs, one at a local grocery store stocking shelves at night, and another washing cars during the day. He wasn't rich, but he wasn't a bad kid. He took care of his mother, helped his little brother with school, and never got into trouble. At least, that's what he thought. Then, one terrible night changed everything. It was raining heavily. The streets were nearly empty, except for the occasional car speeding past. Daniel was on his way home after his shift, exhausted. His shoes were soaked, and he just wanted to get some sleep. As he turned the corner, he saw a man standing near an alley. The man looked desperate, pacing back and forth. His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing around nervously. Daniel hesitated. Something about the man made him uneasy. But then, the man turned to him with wide, frightened eyes. "Help me," the man whispered. "Please." Daniel froze. "What's wrong?" he asked cautiously. "They're after me," the man gasped. I didn't mean for this to happen." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A black car came to a sudden stop at the curb. The doors flew open, and 2 men in dark clothes stepped out. Daniel's heart pounded. "Run," the man whispered. But it was too late. The 2 men grabbed the frightened man by his arms, dragging him toward the car. Daniel took a step back. "Hey, what are you doing?" The taller of the 2 men turned to him, his eyes cold. "You didn't see anything," he said in a low voice. "Walk away." Daniel clenched his fists. He asked for help. Then he made a mistake, the man said simply. Daniel hesitated. His instinct screamed at him to leave, to pretend like he saw nothing. But something about the way the man's hands trembled, the fear in his eyes, Daniel couldn't turn his back. The frightened man suddenly broke free and ran. But before he could take 3 steps, a gunshot rang out. Daniel flinched. The man collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Daniel's breath hitched. Then the men turned to him. For a second, there was silence. Then, "Get him." Daniel's body moved before his mind could process it. He ran. He ran faster than he ever had in his life. He could hear footsteps behind him, gaining. The rain made the pavement slick, but he didn't stop. He turned corners, ducked into alleys, but they were close. Too close. Then he saw it, a fire escape ladder. Without thinking, he jumped, grabbing onto it and pulling himself up. He climbed, heart pounding, lungs burning. He reached the roof just as one of the men fired a shot. The bullet struck the metal railing, sparking on impact. Daniel didn't stop. He ran across the rooftop, leaping onto the next building. He didn't look back. Eventually, after what felt like hours, he found himself near his neighborhood. His clothes were soaked. His legs ached. But he was alive. He stumbled into his small apartment, locking the door behind him. His mother, who had been waiting up, looked at him with concern. "Daniel? What happened?" He shook his head. "Nothing, Mom. Just work." She frowned but didn't push. Daniel barely slept that night. His mind replayed everything. The fear, the gunshot, The look on that man's face before he died. The next morning, he turned on the news. And that's when his blood turned cold. The man he had seen last night, the one who begged for help, was on the screen. The news anchor called him a key witness in a major criminal investigation. And then, the worst part, the police were looking for a suspect. His name flashed across the screen. Daniel Carter. His heart stopped. How? How could they think he did it? His mother gasped, dropping her cup. Daniel, what is this? I didn't do this, he whispered. But the police didn't care. They wanted someone to blame. And Daniel was the perfect target. He had no choice. He needed to find a lawyer. He needed to prove his innocence. But as he would soon learn, justice wasn't always about the truth. And now, 2 months later, as the courtroom erupted in chaos, Daniel realized this wasn't just a trial. This was a fight for his life. Then, another gunshot, and everything went dark. Screams. That was the first thing Daniel heard as he struggled to regain consciousness. His head throbbed. His ears rang. He tried to open his eyes, but the world was a blur. Figures moving, people shouting, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding against the wooden courtroom floor. Gunfire. Another shot echoed through the air. Daniel forced his body to move, but his wrists were still cuffed to the table. His pulse raced as he saw Judge Richardson slumped over in his chair, clutching his shoulder. Blood stained his robes. The bailiff was on the floor, unmoving. Chaos filled the room. People ran for the exits, pushing and shoving. Some dove beneath the benches, shielding themselves. And in the center of it all stood a man, holding a gun. Daniel blinked. It was the same man from the alley. The one who had been dragged away that night. The man who had begged for help. He was alive. But how? The man's hands shook as he pointed the gun toward the defense table, toward Mr. Clayton. His eyes were wild, filled with fear and desperation. "Nobody move," he shouted. His voice cracked. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, his clothes wrinkled, his face hollow. Daniel's heart pounded. The judge groaned, shifting slightly. The prosecutor, Ms. Henderson, had ducked behind her table, gripping her phone, probably calling the police. The bailiff, Daniel didn't want to look. And then, the gunman's eyes locked onto Daniel. For a second, neither of them moved. Then the man's lips trembled. His voice was softer now. "I tried," he whispered. "I tried to warn you." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. You were supposed to be dead," he managed to say. The man let out a bitter laugh, his grip tightening on the gun. "I should be." His eyes darted around, panicked. "But they won't let me die. They need me. Just like they needed you." Daniel felt cold. The courtroom doors burst open. Officers stormed in, guns drawn. "Drop your weapon. Get on the ground now." The man didn't move. His body trembled. He glanced at Daniel one last time, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, he turned the gun on himself. "No." Daniel lunged forward, but it was too late. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. And then, silence. Cold, unbearable silence. The officers moved quickly, securing the scene, shouting commands. People sobbed, whispering prayers, clutching onto loved ones. Daniel just sat there, his body frozen, his breath shallow. This wasn't just a trial anymore. Something bigger was happening. Something dangerous. And now, he was right in the middle of it. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel sat in the cold, gray cell of the county jail, his hands resting on his lap. The air smelled like sweat and bleach. The flickering fluorescent lights made everything feel lifeless. He had barely slept in days. His court-appointed attorney, Mr. Clayton, had promised they would get through this, but Daniel could see the exhaustion in his eyes. They didn't believe him. Nobody did. The news had painted him as a monster, the man who killed a witness, the man who had something to hide. But he wasn't a killer. He was a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now, he was running out of options. "Carter," a voice barked. Daniel looked up to see the guard standing outside his cell. "You've got a visitor." A visitor? His mother had already come that morning. His little brother wasn't allowed inside. He didn't have many friends. Who could it be? The guard led him to a small, private room. A glass panel separated him from the visitors section. The chair across from him was empty. Then the door opened. A woman stepped inside. Daniel's stomach twisted. Miss Henderson, the prosecutor. She sat down, crossing her legs. Her sharp suit was immaculate, her hair pulled into a perfect bun. She didn't look angry. She looked amused. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice smooth. I wanted to speak with you personally. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Aren't you supposed to be sending me to prison? Her lips curved into a smirk. That depends. On what? She leaned forward slightly. On how much you're willing to tell me. Daniel frowned. I already told everyone the truth. I didn't kill him. Miss Henderson tapped her nails against the table. You see, that's what I find interesting. She tilted her head. You were there that night. You saw something. Daniel stiffened. She knew. Somehow, she knew. Miss Henderson's eyes darkened. Tell me, Daniel, did you really think this was about a simple murder? Daniel swallowed hard. What are you talking about? The prosecutor sat back in her chair. You were caught in something much bigger than you understand. She paused, letting her words sink in. And if you don't start talking, you won't survive long enough to see the end of this trial. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Henderson smiled, but it wasn't kind. Let's just say, she murmured, you're not the only one being hunted. Daniel's heart pounded. Before he could respond, she stood up, smoothing her blazer. I'll see you in court, Mr. Carter. And just like that, she walked out, leaving him with more questions than answers. Daniel clenched his fists. Something wasn't right, and if he didn't figure out what was going on, he was as good as dead. Back in the present, as officers swarmed the courtroom and dragged away the lifeless body of the gunman, Daniel sat frozen in his chair. Miss Henderson, standing at a safe distance, met his gaze, and in her eyes, Daniel saw something he hadn't noticed before. Not fear, not relief, but knowing. As if she had expected this to happen, Daniel's breath hitched. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The sirens outside wailed like ghosts in the wind. The courtroom was still a mess. Papers scattered, chairs overturned, and the lingering scent of gunpowder heavy in the air. Officers moved swiftly, securing the scene, speaking in hushed tones into their radios. Paramedics rushed in, tending to the wounded. But Daniel barely noticed any of it. His mind was spinning. The gunman, the same man he had seen that night in the alley, was dead. And Miss Henderson, she knew something. She knew this was coming. Daniel's eyes flickered toward her as she stood near the judge's bench, speaking with an officer. Her face was unreadable, calm despite the chaos. She turned, and for the briefest second, their eyes met. Daniel expected her to look away, to pretend he wasn't there. But she didn't. Instead, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a nod that sent a chill down his spine. And then she walked out, leaving him behind. 2 hours later, Daniel sat in a holding cell deep inside the courthouse. His hands were still cuffed, his heart still racing. Mr. Clayton paced in front of him, his usually calm demeanor shaken. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened. He kept running a hand through his thinning hair, muttering to himself. Finally, he stopped and faced Daniel. This changes everything, he said. Daniel let out a dry laugh. You think? Clayton sighed. Listen, I need you to tell me the truth, and I mean all of it. That man, he hesitated. You knew him, didn't you? Daniel hesitated. If he told Clayton the truth, would it help him? Or would it make things worse? He looked down at his hands, remembering the fear in that man's eyes the night they met. I didn't know him, Daniel admitted. Not really. Clayton narrowed his eyes. But you saw him before. Daniel exhaled slowly. Yeah. He told Clayton everything. About that night. About the alley. About the men in the black car. About the shot that killed the man. Except now, the man wasn't dead. Clayton listened carefully, his expression darkening with every word. When Daniel finished, his attorney let out a deep breath and rubbed his temples. This isn't good. No kidding. Clayton shook his head. This means someone wanted you to take the fall, Daniel. Someone powerful. He started pacing again. And that prosecutor. She knows something. Daniel tensed. You saw it too? Clayton nodded. The way she looked at you. She's not just after a conviction. She's playing a game. Daniel swallowed hard. So what do we do? Clayton stopped and studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. For now, we survive. 1 week earlier, Daniel sat in his jail cell, staring at the gray wall in front of him. Every day was the same. Wake up, eat terrible food, listen to the guards bark orders. Wait for a trial that could ruin his life. Wait for answers he might never get. His mother had visited again that morning. She had tried to be strong, tried to smile, but he could see the fear in her eyes. The way her hands trembled when she reached for him through the glass. It's going to be okay, she had whispered. Daniel had wanted to believe her, but deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. Now, he sat alone, lost in thought. Then, the guard banged on the bars. You got another visitor. Daniel frowned. That was strange. His mother had already been there today. Still, he stood up and followed the guard down the long, dimly lit hallway. He expected to see Clayton. He did not expect to see the man waiting for him. A tall figure in a dark suit. Sharp features. Eyes that held no warmth. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had never seen this man before, but somehow, he knew. This was bad. The guard shoved him into the chair across from the man. The stranger didn't smile. He simply folded his hands on the table and studied Daniel for a moment. Then he spoke. You don't know who I am, he said. His voice was quiet, steady. Daniel said nothing. The man tilted his head. But I know who you are. Daniel clenched his fists. What do you want? The man let out a small, almost amused breath. To warn you. Daniel narrowed his eyes. About what? The man leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. People like you don't survive trials like this. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Is that a threat? He asked. The man shook his head. It's reality. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. I didn't do anything. The man's expression didn't change. That doesn't matter. Silence hung between them. Then the man stood up, adjusting his suit. Tell your attorney to stop pushing, he said. Tell him to take the deal. Daniel frowned. What deal? The man didn't answer. He simply turned and walked toward the door. Before he left, he paused and glanced back at Daniel. Some things are bigger than truth, he murmured. You don't want to end up like the last one. And then he was gone. Daniel sat there, his heart pounding. The last one? The last what? And worse, why did he feel like he already knew the answer? Back in the present, as Clayton gathered his papers and prepared to leave the holding cell, Daniel finally spoke. I think someone tried to warn me, he said. Clayton froze. What? Daniel hesitated. Then, slowly, he told his attorney about the man in the suit, about the cryptic warning, about the deal he had never been offered. Clayton listened, his expression unreadable. When Daniel finished, his lawyer let out a slow breath. I need to make a call, he muttered. Daniel frowned. To who? Clayton didn't answer. He just stood up and walked toward the door. But before he left, he looked back at Daniel, his face grim. This isn't just a case, he said quietly. This is a war. Then the door slammed shut behind him, and Daniel was left alone, staring at the cold, gray walls. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. The trial was the least of his worries now. The jail felt colder that night. The dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniel lay on the stiff mattress in his cell, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind wouldn't stop racing. Everything was wrong. The man from the alley was supposed to be dead. Yet, he had shown up in the courtroom, terrified, desperate. And now, he was actually dead. The prosecutor, Ms. Henderson, wasn't just trying to convict him. She was playing a game. And then there was the man in the suit. Some things are bigger than truth. You don't want to end up like the last one. What did that mean? Daniel exhaled sharply, rolling onto his side. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the gunman's haunted face. He heard the echo of the gunshot. He smelled the metallic scent of blood in the air. And then, a sound. A soft, barely audible click. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He turned his head toward the cell door. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Then, another click. The sound of metal against metal. Daniel sat up slowly, his pulse spiking. Something wasn't right. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet touching the cold concrete. His breath was slow, controlled. He strained his ears, listening. Footsteps. Soft, careful, coming toward his cell. A shadow moved across the dim hallway light. Daniel's stomach clenched. Then, the lock on his cell door shifted. A metallic clunk. And just like that, the door slid open. Daniel's breath hitched. Silence. No guards. No alarms. Just the open door, inviting him into the unknown. For a second, he didn't move. Then he whispered, "What the hell?" 8 hours earlier. Clayton never came back that afternoon. After leaving Daniel in the holding cell, the attorney had vanished. No messages. No updates. Nothing. Instead, a different lawyer, a stiff, stone-faced man in a cheap suit, showed up just before Daniel was transferred back to the county jail. "Mr. Clayton is unavailable," the man had said vaguely. Daniel frowned. Unavailable? What does that mean? The man simply adjusted his tie. "I've been assigned to your case now." Daniel's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Clayton wouldn't just disappear. Not like this. And yet, here he was, stuck with a lawyer he had never met before. A lawyer who wouldn't even look him in the eye. Now, as he stood in the open doorway of his jail cell, Daniel knew. This wasn't an accident. This was planned. By who? The people trying to kill him? Or the people trying to help him? He hesitated. If he left the cell, there was no going back. But if he stayed, would he even be alive by morning? Then, a whisper. "Daniel." His breath caught. A figure emerged from the shadows near the end of the hall. A woman, tall, dark coat, had pulled over her head. She moved quickly, silently. When she got closer, the light flickered over her face, and Daniel's jaw clenched. "Miss Henderson." The prosecutor. "What?" She grabbed his wrist before he could finish his sentence. "No time," she whispered urgently. "Come with me. Now." Daniel yanked his arm back. "Why would I go anywhere with you?" She exhaled sharply, eyes scanning the hallway. "Because if you don't, you'll be dead before sunrise." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. She was lying. She had to be lying. But then, a noise. Distant. Heavy footsteps approaching. Fast. Too fast. Henderson's grip tightened. "Move." Daniel hesitated for half a second longer. Then he ran. They moved quickly, slipping through the dark hallways of the jail. Henderson seemed to know exactly where to go, leading him down corridors, through maintenance doors, down a flight of stairs. Daniel's heart pounded. "How?" he gasped between breaths. "Are we even getting away with this?" Henderson didn't answer. They reached a heavy metal door. She pulled out a key card and swiped it against a reader. The light turned green. The door unlocked. Daniel's stomach dropped. "How do you have that?" Henderson's expression was unreadable. "There are things you don't understand," she said. "No kidding." The door led to the outside. The cold night air hit Daniel's face like a slap. They were in a back alley behind the jail, near a side road. A car was parked there. Black. Tinted windows. Henderson rushed toward it, opening the passenger door. "Get in." Daniel didn't move. "Who are you?" he asked. For the first time, her face softened. "I'm the only person keeping you alive," she said quietly. Daniel clenched his fists. He didn't trust her. Not even a little. But something told him he had no choice. So he got in. Henderson shut the door behind him and climbed into the driver's seat. She started the engine, tires screeching as they sped into the night. Daniel stared at her. Then he whispered the only question that mattered. "What the hell is going on?" Henderson exhaled, gripping the wheel tightly. Then she looked at him. And finally, she told him the truth. "Daniel, you were never supposed to make it to trial." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "What?" Henderson's voice was steady. "You were supposed to be dead weeks ago." Daniel's chest tightened. The threats. The attack in the courtroom. The man in the suit. The warning. "You don't want to end up like the last one." His blood turned to ice. "How deep does this go?" he whispered. Henderson's grip on the wheel tightened. "All the way up." Daniel's breath caught. He was in the middle of something bigger than he had ever imagined. And now, he was officially on the run. The car sped down the empty road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel sat rigid in the passenger seat, his fingers gripping his knees, his mind racing. Ms. Henderson, the prosecutor who was supposed to be sending him to prison, was now helping him escape. Nothing made sense. The city blurred past outside the window. Dimly lit streets, abandoned warehouses, the occasional neon glow of a 24-hour diner. Where are we going? Daniel finally asked, his voice hoarse. Henderson didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the road, her grip tight on the wheel. To a safe house, she said eventually. Somewhere we can talk. Daniel scoffed. Talk? About what? How I was supposed to be dead. Henderson's jaw tensed.
Yes.
Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know whether to be scared or furious. His whole life had turned upside down in a matter of weeks. He had been framed for murder, nearly shot in a courtroom, warned by a man in a suit, and now, he was running from the law with the very person who had been trying to lock him away. He exhaled sharply. What is this really about? He demanded. Henderson hesitated, then glanced at him. It's about power, Daniel.
Power and silence.
Daniel frowned.
That's not an answer.
She sighed. You were framed, yes. But not just because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Daniel's chest tightened. Then why? Henderson glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind them. Because you saw something, she said quietly. Daniel froze. A memory flashed in his mind. That night in the alley. The man who had begged for help. The black car. The men who had chased him. The gunshot. And now, that same man, who should have been dead, had shown up in the courtroom, only to die for real. His stomach twisted. This is about them, isn't it? He whispered. Henderson didn't speak. She didn't need to. Daniel already knew the answer. 1 week earlier. It was late at night, long after the jail had gone quiet. Daniel sat awake in his cell, staring at the cracks in the wall. He felt like a prisoner, not just in a physical sense, but in his own mind. The news still painted him as a murderer. His lawyer, Clayton, was trying his best, but Daniel could see the exhaustion in his eyes. And worst of all, no matter how much Daniel insisted on his innocence, no one believed him. Then, a voice, low, whispered, Carter. Daniel turned. The prisoner in the next cell, an older man with tired eyes and a scar across his cheek, was watching him through the bars. Daniel hesitated. The man leaned in closer. You're in deep, he murmured. Deeper than you even know. Daniel frowned. What are you talking about? The man glanced toward the guard station, making sure no one was listening. Then he turned back to Daniel. There are things going on in this city, he whispered. Things people like you don't usually survive. Daniel's skin prickled. You mean the case? The man let out a dry laugh. Boy, your case is just a piece of it. Daniel's pulse quickened. What do you know? He asked. The man leaned back against the wall. I know the name of the man you saw that night, he said. And I know why they wanted him dead. Daniel's heart pounded. Who was he? The man exhaled slowly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, his name was Martin Lowe. Daniel's breath caught. Martin Lowe. It didn't mean anything to him, but somehow he knew. It was important. And now, 1 week later, as he sat in a speeding car with Miss Henderson, he had to wonder, how much of this had been planned from the start? Back in the present, Henderson pulled the car onto a deserted road leading out of the city. The farther they got, the fewer streetlights there were. Soon, they were surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Where is this safe house? Not far, Henderson said. Daniel hesitated, then spoke carefully. I know his name, he said. Henderson glanced at him. Martin Lowe, he continued. That's who I saw that night. To his surprise, Henderson didn't look shocked. Instead, she simply nodded. I know. Daniel's stomach dropped. He turned in his seat, staring at her. You knew? Henderson kept her eyes on the road.
Yes.
Daniel clenched his fists. Then why didn't you say anything? Because knowing the name and knowing the truth are two different things. Daniel gritted his teeth. Then tell me the truth. Henderson exhaled. Martin Lowe wasn't just some guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was an informant. Daniel's eyebrows shot up. An informant? She nodded. He was feeding information to the feds about a major corruption ring. People with money, power. The kind of people who don't just make problems disappear. They make people disappear. Daniel's mouth went dry. He had been right. This wasn't just about a murder. This was about something much bigger. Henderson continued. Lowe was supposed to testify, but before he could, he was killed. Daniel's skin prickled. Killed. Except, he wasn't killed, Daniel said slowly. He was taken. Henderson nodded. Yes, and someone wanted you to take the fall for it. Daniel's stomach turned. It made sense now. Martin Lowe had been important. So important that when he disappeared, someone needed a scapegoat. And Daniel had been the perfect one. A kid with no connections. No power. Expendable. Disposable. But something had gone wrong. Martin Lowe had resurfaced. And then, just as quickly, he was gone again. Daniel's head spun. Who was behind this? Why was Ms. Henderson helping him? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? Then, a flash of headlights in the rearview mirror. Henderson's eyes narrowed. Daniel turned. A black car. No headlights on. Moving fast. Too fast. His blood ran cold. They found us, Henderson murmured. The car sped closer. Then, the first gunshot rang out, and the chase began. The first gunshot shattered the back window. Glass exploded into the car, tiny shards slicing through the air. Daniel ducked instinctively, heart hammering. Henderson cursed under her breath, gripping the wheel tight as she swerved. The black car behind them didn't slow down. Another gunshot. This time, it struck the trunk, sending a dull thud through the car. Daniel barely had time to think before Henderson yanked the wheel, sending them off the main road onto a winding dirt path surrounded by thick trees. The car jolted violently. Daniel grabbed onto the dashboard to steady himself. "Who the hell is shooting at us?" he shouted. Henderson's jaw tightened. "Take a wild guess." The black car followed, kicking up dust and debris as it roared after them. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one car. If Henderson lost control, they'd crash straight into the trees. Another shot rang out. This time, it hit the back tire. The car jerked hard to the side. Henderson gritted her teeth, fighting for control. "We can't outrun them," Daniel said. "I know," she muttered. Daniel turned to her, breath heavy. "Then what's the plan?" Henderson didn't answer. Instead, she reached under her seat and yanked out a gun. Daniel's eyes widened. "You're armed." "I'm a prosecutor, not an idiot." The black car was getting closer. Daniel turned to look, just in time to see the passenger window roll down. A man in a black ski mask leaned out, gun in hand. Daniel's stomach lurched. "Henderson, get down." The masked man fired. The bullet struck the side mirror, sending sparks flying. Henderson slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screaming against the dirt. The sudden stop caught the black car off guard. It tried to swerve, but the road was too narrow. It clipped a tree, hard. The impact sent it spinning. The vehicle flipped, rolling violently before coming to a stop upside down. Silence. Only the sound of their own ragged breathing remained. Henderson didn't move, her hands still gripping the wheel. Daniel swallowed hard. His pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. "Are they?" Henderson exhaled sharply. "Doesn't matter. We need to go." She threw the car into gear and sped off, leaving the wreckage behind. Daniel stared at her. This wasn't just some prosecutor anymore. She knew how to drive under pressure. She had a gun. She was calm in the middle of a shootout. Who the hell was she? Really? 3 days earlier, Daniel sat in the holding cell, hands cuffed, waiting. It had been over 24 hours since Clayton disappeared. The new lawyer, a stiff man in a cheap suit, was useless. He hadn't even asked Daniel about his side of the story. The guards hadn't said much either. Then, that afternoon, something strange happened. A different guard came to his cell. "Come with me." Daniel frowned. "Where?" The guard didn't answer. Daniel hesitated but stood. The guard led him down a long hallway, away from the other prisoners. They reached a door. The guard unlocked it and gestured for Daniel to go in. Daniel hesitated. Inside the room, sitting at a metal table, was Ms. Henderson. Not in the courtroom. Not with security. Just her. Daniel stepped inside cautiously. The door shut behind him. Henderson leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "You don't trust me," she said. Daniel crossed his arms. "Should I?" Henderson studied him for a long moment. Then, she spoke. "There are people in this city who want you gone, Daniel. People who are powerful. People who don't leave loose ends." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Yeah, I figured that out already." Henderson nodded. "Good. Then you need to listen very carefully." She took a deep breath. "I've been investigating corruption in this city for years," she admitted. "Judges, cops, politicians, they're all connected. And your case? It's tied to something much bigger." Daniel frowned. "Then why are you helping me? You were ready to put me away for life." Henderson met his gaze. "Because I thought you were guilty," she said honestly. "But after what happened in court, I realized something." She leaned in slightly. "They don't just want you in prison, Daniel. They want you gone." A chill ran down his spine. "They framed you," she continued. "Not because you killed Martin Lowe, but because you saw something you weren't supposed to." Daniel exhaled. "You keep saying that, but I don't know what I saw." Henderson's eyes darkened. "You saw the men who took him." Daniel's chest tightened. "Their faces," she said. "Maybe not clearly, but you saw them. And if you're alive, that means there's a chance someone else could connect them." Daniel's stomach twisted. "So they're cleaning up," he whispered. Henderson nodded. And in that moment, Daniel knew. This wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. This was about survival. Back in the present, Henderson drove fast, winding through back roads, taking sharp turns. Daniel was still trying to process everything. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "So what now?" Henderson kept her eyes on the road. "We disappear for a little while." Daniel frowned. "And then?" Henderson glanced at him. "And then we fight back." Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was war. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But one thing was certain. The people who did this to him weren't expecting him to fight back. And that might just be their biggest mistake. The safe house was nothing like Daniel expected. Henderson pulled off the road and drove down a narrow, overgrown path until they reached a small, run-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in dust. It looked abandoned. "Seriously?" Daniel muttered as she parked. Henderson shut off the engine. "It's safe." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Safe? This place looks like it hasn't been lived in for years." "That's the point." She got out of the car and motioned for him to follow. Daniel hesitated but stepped out, his body still tense from the chase. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the rustling of trees and the occasional chirp of crickets. Henderson unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, it was just as run-down as the outside. Dust-covered furniture, creaky wooden floors, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Daniel shut the door behind him. "So, what now?" Henderson set her gun on the table and ran a hand through her hair. "Now? We figure out our next move." Daniel scoffed. "Next move? In case you forgot, we were just shot at. They found us." Henderson exhaled sharply. "I know, but we can't run forever." Daniel clenched his fists. He was tired of running, tired of being hunted, tired of feeling like a pawn in someone else's game. He turned to her. "Then we stop running." Henderson frowned. "What do you mean?" "We stop hiding. We go after them." Henderson stared at him. Then she let out a small laugh. "You want to take on the people who framed you? The same people who just tried to kill us?" Daniel didn't blink. "Yes." Henderson studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Good," she said, "because I was thinking the same thing." 2 nights earlier, the jail was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled. Then, just past midnight, something happened. A low clank, the sound of metal shifting. Daniel frowned and sat up. Then, the lights flickered, and suddenly, his cell door slid open. Daniel's pulse spiked. He stared at the open door, frozen. Then a voice came from the darkness. "Move." A figure stepped into the dim light. A guard. But something was off. The uniform was right, but the face, unfamiliar. Daniel hesitated. "Who are you?" he whispered. The guard didn't answer. He simply reached for his radio, pressed a button, and the security cameras in the hallway went dark. Daniel's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a rescue. This was an execution. He backed up. "No." The guard lunged. Daniel reacted on instinct, dodging to the side just as the guard swung. He hit the wall hard but scrambled away. The guard was fast. Too fast. Daniel barely had time to think before the man was on him again, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through Daniel's shoulder. "Let go," he gritted out. The guard didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his belt, a syringe. Daniel's heart pounded. "They're trying to make it look like I overdosed." Panic surged through him. He twisted, using every ounce of strength he had, and slammed his head backward into the guard's face. The man grunted, his grip loosening for half a second. It was enough. Daniel yanked free and drove his elbow into the guard's ribs. The syringe clattered to the floor. Daniel didn't stop. He shoved the guard back, sending him crashing against the wall. The man groaned, dazed. Daniel didn't wait for him to recover. He ran. The hallway was dark, the security cameras still offline. He had no idea where to go, but he couldn't stay here. He sprinted through the maze of corridors, heart racing. Then, a voice. "Daniel." He skidded to a stop. At the end of the hallway stood Henderson. His breath caught. "You." She gestured sharply. "Come with me."
Now.
Daniel hesitated. He had no reason to trust her. No reason to believe she wasn't leading him into another trap. But behind him, he could hear the guard recovering. He had no choice. He ran toward her. Back in the present, Daniel sat across from Henderson at the wooden table in the cabin. A single lamp cast long shadows across the walls. She pulled out a folder from her bag and slid it toward him. "What's this?" Daniel asked. "Your case," she said simply. "Everything I know. Everything I wasn't supposed to know." Daniel hesitated, then opened the folder. His eyes widened. Inside were documents, photographs, names, all tied to Martin Lowe. But one thing stood out the most. A list of names. And next to them, a label, eliminated. Daniel's throat went dry. Martin Lowe's name was on the list. And beneath his, Daniel Carter. His own name. The date next to it? Tomorrow. His stomach twisted. "They plan to kill me tomorrow." Henderson nodded. "And if we don't move first, they still will." Daniel clenched his fists. He wasn't just a target. He was next. "We need to find out who's at the top of this list," Henderson said. "We need to expose them." Daniel swallowed hard. "And how do we do that?" Henderson pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. Then she turned it to face him. It was a photo of a man. Daniel's blood went cold. It was him, the man in the suit, the one who had warned him in jail. Henderson's voice was quiet. "This man is the key to everything." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. "And if we find him?" he asked. Henderson's expression darkened. "Then we find the people who really run this city." Daniel exhaled shakily. For the first time, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was ready to fight back. But before he could say another word, a sound outside. A car engine. Henderson's eyes snapped to the window. Daniel's stomach clenched. They weren't alone. Then, the front door burst open, and the world exploded into chaos. The door slammed open with a violent crack. Before Daniel could react, Henderson grabbed him by the collar and yanked him to the ground. "Stay down," she hissed. Gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through the wooden walls, splintering them into sharp shards. The dimly lit cabin was instantly filled with chaos. The deafening sounds of gunfire, the acrid scent of burning wood, and the suffocating dust that billowed into the air. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. They had found them. "Move," Henderson ordered. She crawled toward the overturned table and pulled her gun from her waistband. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to focus. If he froze now, he was dead. More bullets tore through the room. Then, silence. A voice from outside. "Come out, Carter. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The voice was calm, controlled. Daniel clenched his jaw. It was him, The man in the suit. Henderson locked eyes with Daniel. She mouthed one word, "Run." He shook his head. "Not without you." Henderson scowled but didn't argue. She pointed toward the back of the cabin. There was a small, half-rotted door leading outside. Daniel nodded. He understood. But before they could move, the voice spoke again. "You think running will help?" The man's tone was almost amused. "You're only delaying the inevitable." A single set of footsteps approached the front entrance. Slow, deliberate. Henderson whispered, "Get ready." The door creaked as a shadow stretched across the floor. Then, the man stepped inside. 12 hours earlier, Daniel sat on the edge of the old, dusty couch in the cabin, staring at the folder Henderson had given him. Inside were names, judges, politicians, police officers, all of them connected to something deep, something rotten at the core of the city. "Who are these people?" Daniel asked, voice low. Henderson leaned against the table, arms crossed. "They run things from the shadows," she said. "They decide who wins, who loses, who lives, who dies." Daniel swallowed hard. "And Martin Lowe?" Henderson's face darkened. He was a problem. He was going to testify about something big, something that would have blown this whole thing wide open. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "So they made him disappear." Henderson nodded. "And when he resurfaced, they made sure he disappeared for good." Daniel exhaled sharply. "And me?" Henderson hesitated. Then she spoke carefully. "You were a loose end," she said. "They needed someone to take the blame." Daniel clenched his fists. "So they picked me."
Yes.
Daniel's stomach twisted. His whole life had been turned into a game, a move on someone else's chessboard. And now, if they didn't do something, he would lose. "We need proof," Henderson said. "Something concrete. Something that ties them to Martin Lowe's death." Daniel stared at the papers in front of him. Then he spotted something. A photo. It was grainy, black and white, taken from what looked like a security camera. It showed a man standing outside a warehouse. The same man who had spoken to him in jail. Daniel's pulse quickened. "I know him," he whispered. Henderson's eyes snapped to the photo. "You're sure?" Daniel nodded. "He came to see me in jail. He told me to take a deal." Henderson frowned. There was no deal. Daniel's blood ran cold. Then what was he trying to do? Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Silence you." Daniel inhaled sharply. Everything was connected. Martin Lowe, the trial, the people pulling the strings. And this man, whoever he was right in the center of it all. Henderson's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, checked the screen, and cursed under her breath. "They found us," she muttered. Daniel's stomach twisted. Then the front door burst open. Back in the present, the man in the suit stepped into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. He wasn't holding a gun. He didn't need to. The armed men behind him had that covered. Henderson tightened her grip on her weapon but didn't fire. "Not yet." The man in the suit smiled. "Ms. Henderson," he greeted, almost politely. "Mr. Carter." Daniel felt his hands ball into fists. "You've caused a lot of trouble," the man continued. He stepped forward, casually brushing a speck of dust off his sleeve. "But it ends here." Henderson scoffed. "You're pretty confident for someone standing in a room with two people who don't want to die." The man chuckled. "If you wanted to kill me, you would have already." Daniel's heart pounded. This man was dangerous. Not just because he was powerful, because he knew he was powerful. The man turned to Daniel. "You should have taken my advice," he said. "You should have stayed quiet." Daniel swallowed hard. Then he spoke. "And you should have made sure Martin Lowe was actually dead the first time." For the first time, the man's smirk faded. Henderson seized the moment. She fired. The room exploded into action. The armed men ducked, bullets ripping through the cabin walls. Daniel hit the ground as chaos erupted around him. Henderson grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the back door. "Move!" she shouted. Daniel scrambled to his feet, heart racing. They crashed through the rotting back door, stumbling into the cold night air. Behind them, the gunman shouted orders. More shots rang out. The two of them sprinted into the forest, branches slapping against their faces, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They ran, and ran, and ran, until the gunfire faded, until only the sound of their pounding footsteps remained. Finally, they collapsed near a fallen tree, gasping for air. Henderson turned to Daniel. "We're out of time," she said. Daniel swallowed hard. "Then we end this." Henderson's eyes darkened. "How?" Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he looked at her, determination burning in his gaze. "We find out what Martin Lowe was going to say." Henderson nodded. "And when we do?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "We tell the world." A crack echoed in the distance, footsteps in the woods. They weren't safe yet, and the real fight was just beginning. The night was thick with silence, but Daniel could feel it. Someone was out there, watching, hunting. He and Henderson crouched behind the fallen tree, their breaths shallow. The distant crack of branches in the woods sent shivers down Daniel's spine. "They're searching for us," Henderson whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't doubt it. They had barely escaped the cabin, and now, the people who wanted them dead weren't far behind. Henderson pulled out her gun, checking the magazine. Daniel exhaled. "How many bullets do you have left?" Henderson gave him a grim look. "Not enough." Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. "Great." Another sound. A twig snapping, closer this time. Daniel tensed. They had to move. Now. Henderson grabbed his wrist. "Follow me. Stay low." They weaved through the dense forest, keeping to the shadows. Every movement felt like a gamble. Every rustling leaf, a threat. Then, a voice. "We know you're out there, Carter." Daniel froze. That voice. It was him, the man in the suit. "You can run." The voice continued, smooth, confident. "But how long do you think you'll last?" Daniel's pulse pounded. Henderson nudged him forward. "Keep moving," she whispered. Daniel obeyed, but the words rang in his head. How long could they last? Because this wasn't just about surviving. This was about winning. 10 hours earlier, Daniel and Henderson had found an old radio inside the cabin. It barely worked, static crackling through the speakers, but it was something. They needed information. Then, through the static, a familiar name surfaced. Martin Lowe. Daniel sat up straight. "Turn it up." Henderson twisted the dial. The voice on the radio became clearer. A key informant in an ongoing investigation. Lowe had been scheduled to testify before disappearing. Authorities now confirmed that he was found dead earlier this week, though details remain scarce. Daniel's stomach dropped. Official cause of death has not been disclosed. However, sources claim Lowe was in contact with multiple government agencies before his disappearance. Daniel clenched his fists. "They're covering it up." Henderson nodded. "Of course they are." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Martin Lowe had risked everything to bring the truth to light. And now, that truth was buried. Unless they uncovered it first. Daniel turned to Henderson. "We need to find out who Lowe was talking to." Henderson exhaled. "That won't be easy." Daniel met her gaze. "Nothing about this has been easy." Henderson studied him for a long moment. Then she smirked slightly. "All right, Carter," she said. "Let's crack this thing open." Back in the present, they moved deeper into the forest, the voices behind them growing fainter. Then, a clearing. Daniel skidded to a stop. In the middle of the clearing sat an old hunting shack. Weathered. Rusted. Henderson cursed under her breath. "We can't stay here." Daniel knew she was right. If they stopped now, they'd be sitting ducks. But before he could respond, a beam of light flashed through the trees. A flashlight. They weren't alone. Henderson pulled Daniel behind a large tree. 3 figures emerged from the woods, moving toward the shack. Armed. One of them spoke into a radio. No sign of them yet. Daniel's heart pounded. They had to get out of here. But then, the wind shifted. The rustling of leaves. A dry branch snapped beneath Daniel's foot. The men turned. And just like that, they were spotted. Over there. Daniel barely had time to react before the first shot rang out. He hit the ground, rolling behind cover as bullets ripped through the air. Henderson returned fire, taking down one of the gunmen with a well-placed shot. But the others kept coming. Daniel's mind raced. They couldn't stay and fight. They were outgunned, outnumbered. They had to run. He grabbed Henderson's arm. "Come on." They sprinted through the trees, dodging between trunks, the gunfire echoing behind them. Then, A steep drop. A ravine. Daniel skidded to a halt just in time. The ground beneath them sloped down into darkness. Rocks. Jagged branches. No way out. The gunmen were closing in. Trapped. Henderson turned to him. We jump. Daniel's eyes widened. Are you insane? It's either that or get shot. The gunmen were seconds away. Daniel's breath hitched. Then, Henderson grabbed his hand. And they jumped. The air rushed past them. The world spun. Then, impact. Daniel hit the ground hard, tumbling down the slope. Rocks tore at his skin. His vision blurred. Then, darkness. Silence. Everything faded. Sometime later, Daniel groaned. His whole body ached. His eyes fluttered open. The forest loomed above him, swaying in the wind. He was alive. Barely. A groan beside him. Henderson. She was stirring, wincing as she pushed herself up. They had survived the fall. But as Daniel looked up at the ravine's edge, he knew. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. Henderson sat up, rubbing her head. Well, she muttered, that sucked. Daniel let out a breathless laugh. Yeah. Then, a new sound. A voice. From above. Keep looking. Daniel and Henderson exchanged a glance. The gunmen were still searching. They had to keep moving. They had to end this. Daniel clenched his jaw. For Martin Lowe. For the truth. And for their own survival. Daniel's body screamed in protest as he pushed himself up from the damp forest floor. His ribs ached. His knees were scraped. And his head was still spinning from the fall. But they were alive. Henderson groaned beside him, rubbing her shoulder. Next time, let's not jump off a cliff, yeah? Daniel let out a shaky breath. Noted. Above them, the voices of the gunmen still echoed through the trees. They went down here, one of them said. Check the bottom. Daniel's stomach clenched. They weren't out of danger yet. Henderson looked at him, her eyes sharp. We need to move. Now. Daniel nodded. Together, they forced themselves to their feet and slipped deeper into the forest, keeping low, their breaths controlled. Every rustling leaf, every snapped twig sent a spike of fear through Daniel's chest. They had no weapons left, no plan, and the people hunting them wouldn't stop until they were dead. 12 hours earlier, the old radio inside the cabin had given them something. A name, a single name. Raymond Holloway. Daniel had never heard of him, but the way Henderson's expression darkened when the name was spoken told him everything he needed to know. Who is he? Daniel had asked. Henderson had hesitated, then exhaled sharply. He's the one pulling the strings. Daniel had frowned. You mean, he's the reason Martin Lowe is dead, she interrupted. The reason you were framed. The reason we're running for our lives. Daniel's blood ran cold. He flipped through the papers in the folder Henderson had given him. And there it was, a blurry photo of Raymond Holloway, an older man, white hair, sharp eyes, and a suit so crisp it looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. Below the photo, in bold print, CEO, Holloway International. Daniel's stomach twisted. He wasn't just some random crime boss. This man was powerful. Too powerful. Daniel looked up. How do we stop him? Henderson had clenched her jaw. We find proof. Real proof. Something that ties him directly to Lowe's murder. Daniel exhaled. And where do we even start? Henderson had tapped a single address written in the documents. An office. Holloway's headquarters. Daniel's eyes had widened. You're not serious. Henderson had smirked. I'm always serious. Back in the present, Daniel and Henderson moved deeper into the woods, their bodies exhausted but their minds running on adrenaline. They needed to reach the city. They needed to get to Holloway's office before it was too late. But first, they had to survive the night. A flashlight beam swept through the trees. Daniel sucked in a breath, pressing his back against a tree trunk. Henderson crouched beside him, eyes locked on the movement ahead. Two men, armed. One of them spoke into a radio. They've got to be down here somewhere. Spread out. Daniel felt his pulse hammering. They were too close. Henderson looked at him and mouthed a single word. Run? Daniel nodded. On the count of 3, they sprinted. The forest erupted with noise. Over there, gunfire rang out. Daniel ducked as a bullet struck a tree inches from his head. He pushed his legs harder, lungs burning. Then, a clearing. And beyond it, a road. Daniel's heart leaped. Henderson. This way. They burst onto the pavement just as headlights appeared in the distance. A car. Henderson didn't hesitate. She stepped into the road, waving her arms. The car screeched to a halt. The driver, a young man in a baseball cap, rolled down his window. What the hell? No time to explain, Henderson panted. We need a ride.
Now.
The driver hesitated. Then the gunman emerged from the trees. The driver's eyes widened. Oh, hell no. Henderson yanked open the car door. Drive. The driver didn't argue. He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires squealed as they sped off, bullets ricocheting off the pavement behind them. Daniel collapsed into the seat, chest heaving. They had escaped. For now. 40 minutes later, the city skyline loomed ahead, bright lights piercing through the darkness. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead. We made it, he muttered. Henderson nodded, but didn't relax.
Not yet.
The driver glanced at them in the rearview mirror. You guys want to tell me what the hell is going on? Daniel hesitated. It's complicated. The driver let out a low whistle. Yeah, no kidding. You guys got people shooting at you. I should kick you out of my car. Henderson pulled out a $100 bill and tossed it onto the dashboard. The driver grinned. Or I could just keep driving. Daniel sighed. Take us to. Henderson cut him off. We need a place to lay low first. Then we hit Holloway's office. Daniel frowned. We don't have time. We'll be dead if we go in unprepared, Henderson snapped. Daniel clenched his jaw but knew she was right. Fine. Where do we go? Henderson thought for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and typed something in. We go to someone who can help us. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Who? Henderson exhaled. Then she showed him the screen. A single name. James Clayton. Daniel's eyes widened. His old lawyer. The one who had disappeared. He looked at Henderson. He's alive. Henderson nodded. Barely. But he has something we need. Daniel swallowed hard. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle. If Clayton had survived, then maybe, just maybe, he had the evidence they needed to bring Holloway down. Daniel sat back in his seat. They were running out of time. And if they didn't get to Clayton first, Holloway's men would. The car sped through the city streets, weaving between lanes, headlights blurring past in streaks of yellow and white. Daniel's mind raced. James Clayton, his old lawyer, the one who had disappeared without a trace. Now, suddenly, he was alive? And Henderson thought he had something that could take down Holloway? It felt too good to be true. But they had no choice. If there was even a chance that Clayton had the evidence they needed, they had to find him first. Where is he? Daniel asked, breaking the silence. Henderson's fingers tightened around her phone. He went underground. I only found him because he sent a coded message through a private channel. He must have known we'd come looking. Daniel swallowed hard. Or he knew they would. Henderson nodded grimly.
Exactly.
The driver glanced at them through the rearview mirror. So, where am I taking you to? Henderson tapped her phone. An old motel on the edge of town. The driver whistled. That place? It's a dump. Henderson smirked. Which is why it's perfect. 30 minutes later, the car pulled into a nearly deserted parking lot. The motel looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Flickering neon lights, a broken ice machine, and a sign that read "No refunds" in peeling red letters. Daniel exhaled. Looks cozy. Henderson opened the car door. Let's go. They stepped out, scanning their surroundings. No cars in the lot except for one, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. Henderson led the way to room 14B, knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times. Silence. Daniel shifted uneasily. You sure he's here? Then, the door cracked open. A single bloodshot eye peeked through the gap. And then, the door swung open, revealing James Clayton. Daniel barely recognized him. The man who once wore crisp suits and spoke with unwavering confidence now looked wrecked. His beard was overgrown, his eyes hollow, his clothes wrinkled. He smelled like sweat and whiskey. But when he saw Daniel, something flickered behind his tired gaze. Carter, he muttered. You're alive. Daniel stepped inside.
Barely.
Clayton locked the door behind them, glancing at Henderson. Did you bring them here? Henderson crossed her arms. You sent the message. I figured you wanted to be found. Clayton let out a bitter laugh. Not by you. Daniel frowned. We don't have time for games. You disappeared, Clayton. You left me to rot. And now we find out you're alive. Clayton sighed heavily. I didn't leave you. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then what happened? Clayton rubbed his temples. I got too close to the truth. I found out what really happened to Martin Lowe.
And I paid the price.
Daniel exchanged a glance with Henderson. Clayton exhaled and walked to a small duffel bag in the corner of the room. He unzipped it and pulled out a USB drive. This, he said, holding it up, is why they wanted me dead. Daniel stared at the small piece of plastic. What's on it? Clayton hesitated, then tossed it to Henderson.
Proof.
Henderson plugged the drive into her phone. The screen lit up with files, videos, documents, phone records, and then a recording. She tapped play. A grainy, black and white surveillance video flickered onto the screen. Daniel's breath caught. It was Martin Lowe, alive, in an interrogation room, tied to a chair. A man paced in front of him, and then the camera angle shifted, revealing his face. Daniel's stomach twisted. Raymond Holloway. The recording played out in chilling silence. Holloway leaned in, speaking softly to Lowe. You should have stayed quiet, he said. Lowe spat blood onto the floor. I don't fear you. Holloway smirked. You should. Then he nodded, and a gun was pressed to Lowe's head. The screen went black. Henderson's grip on the phone tightened. Jesus. Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. This was it. The proof. Not just of Holloway's involvement, but of murder. Clayton rubbed his face. This is why they tried to kill me. I got my hands on this before it could disappear. But I didn't have a way to release it without getting myself killed first. Daniel swallowed hard. Now they did. He turned to Henderson. We leak it. Henderson nodded. Send it to the press. The feds.
Everywhere.
Clayton hesitated. It won't be that easy. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Why not? Clayton exhaled. Because they're watching. Then, a sound outside. Engines. Tires crunching against gravel. Daniel's stomach dropped. Henderson ran to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. A black SUV. Followed by another. Then another. Then, a knock at the door. Daniel's pulse hammered. Clayton's face went pale. They found me. The knock came again. A voice calm, controlled. We know you're in there. Daniel's breath hitched. The voice was familiar. It was him, Holloway's right-hand man. The one who had warned Daniel in jail. The one who had told him to stay quiet. And now, he was standing on the other side of the door. Henderson pulled out her gun. Clayton reached for something in his bag. Daniel clenched his fists. They had the truth. But would they live long enough to share it? Then, the door handle twisted, and everything went black. The door burst open. A flash of movement. A crash. Daniel barely had time to react before chaos swallowed the room. Gunfire erupted. Henderson fired first, hitting the nearest man in the shoulder. He staggered back, cursing in pain. Clayton dove behind the couch, fumbling for something in his bag. Daniel's heart pounded. The room was too small. No cover. No way out. The second gunman rushed forward. Daniel barely managed to duck before a fist swung toward his face. He twisted, grabbing the man's wrist, forcing the gun away. A shot fired, hitting the ceiling. Clayton yanked a baseball bat from his bag and swung. The man grunted as the bat connected with his ribs. He stumbled back, but before Clayton could swing again, a new voice cut through the chaos. Enough. The room froze. Daniel turned. Him, the man in the suit, Holloway's right-hand man. He stood in the doorway, calm, unfazed, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine black jacket. Two more men stood behind him, guns raised, unwavering. Daniel swallowed hard. They were trapped. Henderson, still holding her weapon, kept her breathing steady. But Daniel could see the calculation in her eyes. She knew. This fight was over. The man in the suit sighed, stepping inside. You really should have listened, Carter. Daniel clenched his jaw. Yeah? And done what? Let you kill me? The man smirked.
It would have been painless.
Daniel's hands curled into fists. And Martin Lowe? A flicker of something crossed the man's face. Annoyance, maybe even regret. But it was gone in an instant. I warned you, he said simply. You don't win against people like us. Henderson's voice was cold. You're wrong. The man chuckled. Am I? Then he stepped closer, just enough for Daniel to see the slight bulge beneath his suit jacket. A holstered gun. Daniel's pulse pounded. If they made one wrong move, they were dead. Then, a buzzing sound. The man frowned, reached into his pocket, checked his phone, and his face changed. For the first time, Daniel saw something new in his expression. Panic. He turned sharply toward his men. We need to go.
Now.
Daniel's stomach twisted. What? Then Clayton's phone buzzed, too. He checked it, paused. Then, a slow grin spread across his face. Oh, Clayton muttered. That's beautiful. Henderson's eyes darted between them. What? Clayton turned the phone toward them. On the screen, a breaking news alert. Daniel's breath caught. It was everywhere. Every major news station. Every social media platform. Surveillance footage leaked. CEO Raymond Holloway linked to murder of informant Martin Lowe. The video, the evidence. It was out. Holloway's empire, his untouchable power, was crumbling in real time. The man in the suit clenched his jaw. He knew it, too. For the first time, he wasn't in control anymore. He turned back to Daniel, eyes sharp. This isn't over. Daniel exhaled. Yeah, it is. For a moment, the man looked like he wanted to say something else. But then, his radio crackled. A voice, urgent. Sir, we've got a problem. FBI agents are outside Holloway Tower. They're taking people in. Daniel's chest tightened. It was working. They were winning. The man in the suit exhaled sharply. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. His men followed. Just like that, they were gone. Silence filled the room. Daniel could barely believe it. His breath came fast, his pulse still racing. Henderson let out a slow exhale, lowering her gun. Clayton laughed, shaky, disbelieving. Damn, that actually worked. Daniel sat down heavily on the couch. It was over. The nightmare was over. 3 days later, the city was different now. It was in shock. The headlines were everywhere. Raymond Holloway arrested in federal investigation. Police officers, judges, business executives, all of them under scrutiny. Martin Lowe's name was no longer buried. His truth had been heard. And Daniel Carter? He was free. All charges against him had been dropped. His name was cleared. And for the first time in months, he could breathe. 1 week later, Daniel stood in front of Martin Lowe's grave. The wind rustled through the trees. The sky was a soft shade of gray. Henderson stood beside him, hands in her coat pockets. They didn't speak for a while. Then, finally, Daniel exhaled. He didn't deserve to die like that. Henderson nodded. No, he didn't. Daniel looked down at the headstone. Martin Lowe had been a good man, a brave man, and even though it had cost him his life, his story had changed everything. Daniel swallowed. What happens now? Henderson glanced at him. Then she smirked. Well, she said, I hear the FBI is looking for people who know how to find the truth. Daniel blinked. Are you? She grinned. I think you'd be good at it. Daniel let out a breathless laugh. You're serious? Henderson shrugged. Think about it. You wanted to run from this at first, but you didn't. You fought back. Daniel hesitated. He had spent so long just surviving. But now? Now he had a choice. He glanced at the grave one last time. Then he nodded. All right, he said. Let's go find the truth. Daniel Carter had been through hell. He had been framed, hunted, and nearly killed more times than he could count. But in the end, the truth won. Raymond Holloway, once untouchable, now sat in a federal prison cell, awaiting trial. The people who had orchestrated Martin Lowe's murder, the same people who had tried to silence Daniel, were either arrested or on the run. The city was still reeling from the scandal, but one thing was clear. Corruption had been exposed. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel was free. Yet, freedom came with something else. Purpose. He had spent so much time trying to prove his innocence that he hadn't realized what he had truly become: a fighter, a seeker of truth. He wasn't just a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had uncovered something bigger than himself, and now he had a choice. He could go back to his old life, pretend none of this had happened, or he could do what Martin Lowe had tried to do: expose the lies, reveal the truth, make sure people like Holloway never won again. Standing beside Henderson outside the FBI's field office, he knew what his answer was. He wasn't running anymore. He was stepping into the fire, by choice. Because the truth? It was worth fighting for. And he wasn't done fighting yet.